tie in with Ecclesiastes because this is one of the issues Solomon keeps coming back to as well. So Solomon's going to come back to vanity a lot, but he's going to keep bringing up evil as well. So there's one verse off the top of my head. He'll talk about, there is an evil I have seen under the sun, and it's foolishness coming out of a ruler. You know, and he talks about, like, why is this the way it is? You know, and so if you talk to anyone, in fact, the person I was chatting with on the airplane, one of the reasons they had struggled with their faith was the idea of why does God do certain painful things to people. So she had a friend of hers whose child got very sick, and so she was very bothered by that fact. And so this is a very pertinent topic. It's a very serious topic. It's one of those like weighty issues that we all struggle with at some point in our life, probably. And so because it's a weighty and serious issue, we're going to start off with a video by Lutheran Satire. There is a point to this, and I am setting the stage for something we're going to talk about in just a little bit. If you have not seen Lutheran Satire, it is meant to be funny, but also make a point.
Okay, Patrick, tell us a bit more about this atheism thing. Yeah, Patrick, tell us.
Certainly, yes. Well, you see, in ancient times, people like you invented stories about various gods creating the earth and mankind because you lacked the scientific knowledge necessary to understand the origins of the universe. But in my day, thanks to scientific progress, we do understand these things, and so it's no longer necessary for us to fool ourselves into thinking that some silly god created us.
But what about all that stuff that defies scientific explanation? Isn't that evidence of God's existence? Yeah, riddle us that, Patrick.
Stuff like what?
Well, how about the multitude of miracles in the Bible, chief among them the resurrection of our Lord Jesus?
Oh, you sweet little simpletons, people don't rise from the dead.
Except for that one time Jesus rose from the dead. Yeah, that was awesome.
No, what I'm saying is that Jesus never rose from the dead.
And how do you know that, Patrick?
Because it's not possible for people to rise from the dead.
Yeah, we know. That's why it was sort of a big deal when Jesus rose from the dead.
Look, I think you're far too uneducated to understand this, but if people could rise from the dead, then people would rise from the dead. If Jesus could rise from the dead, surely someone else would have risen from the dead as well.
Other people have risen from the dead.
Like who?
Like all the people in the Bible who rose from the dead because Jesus rose them from the dead not long before he himself rose from the dead.
Well, obviously you can't count those examples.
Why not, Patrick?
Because they come from the Bible, and the Bible is a ridiculous book full of silly stories that couldn't possibly happen, like...
People rising from the dead?
Exactly.
Right. So according to you, the resurrection doesn't prove the existence of God because it never happened. And we know it never happened because we know that people can't rise from the dead. And we know that people can't rise from the dead because no one ever has risen from the dead, if you don't count all the people who have risen from the dead. I think I'm onto your little trick here, Patrick. Yeah, you're a sneaky little secularist, Patrick. So your strategy for proving the non-existence of God is to systematically rule out every piece of evidence for the existence of God, solely because that evidence could be used to prove the existence of God. What a perfectly reasonable use of the scientific method, Patrick. Yeah, we'd love to see you employ this strategy in the laboratory, Patrick. Hey, Cornwall, I just proved that there's no such thing as barium. And how'd you do that, Donald? By throwing out all the samples of barium. I'm surprised more defense attorneys don't attempt this in the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I have conclusively proven to you that my client is innocent, as long as you ignore the murder weapon, his confession, and the 400 witnesses who saw him stab that guy in the face.
Clearly you're not enlightened enough to understand.
I mean, really, Patrick. By your logic, the first president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod could prove himself to be the best-looking man in the world. All he'd have to do is lock every other male on the planet in his dressing room right before his beauty pageant begins.
Oh, no, even then I would still lose.
So I may not be a scientist, Patrick. I may not possess your superior intellect and education. I may even be a superstitious Neanderthal who thinks that thunder is what happens when God yells at leprechauns. I think it's the result of a shockwave in the air due to the sudden thermal expansion of plasma in the lightning channel, but that's because I'm stupid. Nonetheless, I still know a lame argument when I hear one. And when you accuse Christians of remaining in ignorance because they refuse to allow any evidence to challenge their theistic worldview, only to dismiss every eyewitness account of our Lord's resurrection solely because it challenges your atheistic worldview, well, that's not just lame. It's also a wee bit of the clover calling the grass green. That's an adorable Celtic twist on a classic idiom, Patrick.
Don't be absurd. I treat the Bible exactly the way I treat everything else. I'm a man of reason and evidence and facts. I'm a man of science, a world-renowned evolutionary biologist. I defy you to give me one example of something that I believe in, despite no scientist ever having seen it happen.
Evolution.
Dang it. you actually read your holy book? Your God is a heartless, hateful, murderous ogre. There's no reason to believe in such a vile deity.
I'm sorry, Patrick. I'm going to need a second to recover from that. Yeah, Patrick, stop in the name of logic before you break my brain. Placing your failure to properly understand the justice of the Almighty aside for a moment, did you honestly just argue that God doesn't exist because he's mean? Why, if being a jerk made you cease to exist, then every war in human history would have been over the second it started. Rosie O'Donnell would have disappeared in a puff of smoke in 1998 instead of getting fired from The View once every 7 minutes. And that jerk who makes those Lutheran satire videos wouldn't even be able to finish recording.
All right. So yeah, we're talking about the problem of evil. As you see, it is a humorous way to put a point on it. But one of the big issues people have is they build a case that kind of looks like this. If God is all-knowing, if God is all good, and there is suffering in the world, then either God is not good or God doesn't control everything. So you see the logical progression of that. The problem with something like that is none of those points actually lead to that conclusion. Because if God is all-knowing, you can't then say, well, then he wouldn't let this happen. If God is all-powerful, then he wouldn't let this happen. There's all sorts of situations that it sounds very reasonable to say, if God is all-powerful and if God is all good, then he would not let this happen. That's using our limited understanding of the world to project someone who understands things way, way, way more. So I'm going to use the, have you guys all heard of J. Warner Wallace? He does Cold Case Christianity. If you're not familiar with him, I think he's a former lawyer who really does a whole lot in kind of using that type of reasoning to prove the existence of God and to talk about topics with Christianity. So he wrote an article back in 2018, and he dealt with this problem of evil, and he puts it this way. He says, so what we're talking about, if you want a theological term for it, it's called a theodicy. It's basically an answer to God's justice. That's what that word means. So if I ever slip up and still use the word theodicy, just translate it. It's God's justice. So he says, a vindication of God's goodness and justice in the face of the existence of evil. So he's defining theodicy. He said, like many of the criminal cases I worked on as a detective, the case for God's existence, given the presence of evil, is a case made cumulatively. And so what he's saying is, just as if you go into a courtroom, you're going to have a huge swath of evidence, and you're going to have a whole bunch of different points that you're going to make, and hopefully the overwhelming evidence will prove your point, rather than, I just have one really good solid argument. Because if you just have like one really good solid argument, what you're going to run into, and I mean the people in this room who've gone through hard times could probably tell you, there are certain encouragements that you will receive that are helpful, and then there's other encouragements that you will receive that are not helpful. And so that's something you've got to keep in mind, is you might think something is like, oh, it's just the clincher, it just nails it. But it's really completely based on the person who's hearing it, whether they're convinced by it or not. So I'm not going to really tell you how to give comfort or answers to people. Like, I can tell you what's comforting to me in some of the things I've gone through, but I can't tell you what's comforting to everyone else. I don't know. But I can tell you the mindset that we should have, and I can tell you the mindset that we can express to other people, and I can tell you sometimes it's best just to listen. I think Job's friends were a perfect example for the first week. They just sat there and listened. Then they started to talk. So there are times where it's good just to keep your mouth shut, because there's not much you can say in the moment that's going to be helpful. Now, as far as the problem of evil, the first thing we have to understand is the definition of this word evil. Philosophers and people all throughout history have given different meanings to the word evil. I have a few there on your handout. One definition of evil is moral evil. It is basically a breaking of God's commandments. Moral evil is, I go out and I commit murder. That's a moral evil. That's just what it is. God said don't, I went and did, so there you go. The other type of evil that you'll see in the Bible, and it's important to understand this distinction, because there are times where the Bible will clearly say that God ordained evil, and you kind of look at that and go, what? We can get into that, but a lot of times that's more this calamity evil. Calamity evil is basically natural disasters. It's chaos, it's war, it's things that happen that cause a bad result, but they're not necessarily caused by someone going out and committing a sin. So if I'm driving down the road and there's a big landslide that comes down the hill and takes out my car, that's obviously an evil thing. It's not a morally evil thing. It just happened. It's an act of God. It's an act of nature. In fact, they don't do it so much anymore because they're afraid of the word God. But back in the day, you often heard news reports that would talk about a hurricane or something as like an act of God. You got these act of God moments and that's this idea of calamity evil. One of the best definitions, though, is, and this will lead into further discussion, I believe a really good, simple definition of evil is you had an expectation, and that expectation was not met. Okay? So a stupid illustration of evil would be this. If I said I was going to draw a circle, and I drew this, it is an unmet expectation. So you expected me to draw a complete circle. I didn't. Therefore, this has left something undone, and therefore it is evil. Now, obviously, we wouldn't look at a half-drawn circle and say, that's evil. Okay, but the idea is, you think about in life, we expect certain things from our life. Like we expect to get born, hopefully, and we expect to live a relatively peaceful life and then die, at like age 80. So if something happens and we get very, very sick and we spend, let's say we got really sick at age 40 and we spent 10 years in the hospital and then died at age 50, we would look at that and say that's evil. Make sense? Because it's an unmet expectation. My full picture that I was expecting didn't happen. All right? So I'll use an example. So like when Drake was born, my expectations were very subverted. I went in there, it was right after a core camp, and like literally I went home for lunch and Deb's like, it's time to go to the hospital. And it was, let's go. And so we headed in the hospital, and the doctors were telling us like, oh yeah, I mean by the time like the baby starts to come, it'll be really quick. Okay, well, like she was in labor from basically when we went into the hospital. I think the next morning, she may have started to push around like 7 in the morning. And for about the next 5 hours, that baby didn't move. And so that is like an illustration of something that on a very trivial level is evil. It's an unmet expectation. It's something that didn't work the way we planned. And so we're sitting there expecting and nothing. And expecting and nothing. And expecting and disappointment. And that's the way it turned out. Now, as the story progressed, you guys have probably already heard this, so you know the story. But it turned out he wasn't coming out, and so they realized they were going to have to do a C-section. Well, we get all kitted up for the C-section. First they said we're going to have to wait for a while, and then it turns out we weren't going to have to wait for a while. We go down to the hallway, we're sitting there, they put me in that stupid zoot suit thing with the booties and the all wrapped up so that none of my facial hair can land inside, the baby or something, I don't know. But I'm all bound up and kitted out, and I'm sitting in the hallway looking like an idiot, which is pretty evil in itself. And they forget to call me in. And so Deb's there on the C-section table. I think they had already cut her open, and then she had made a comment like, "What about my husband?" They're like, "Oh yeah." And so they went and grabbed me and brought me in, and basically don't touch anything. And so every point along this story has been very much like that didn't go according to plan. All right, and as the story progressed, I'm sitting there at the head. All right, and I'm holding Deb's hand, and Drake comes out. He's not making a single sound, and he's not a normal color. All right, and what had happened, for those of you who haven't heard the story, he had his umbilical cord wrapped around his neck twice, and so he wasn't breathing, he wasn't the normal color, there was just all sorts of issues. And so they cut the cord, which I was supposed to cut the cord, so that's a disappointment, but whatever. I've never experienced it, so I don't know what I missed. But I'm sure it would be weird. And the most I didn't get to do it there either. The most traumatizing part of it all, though, was they brought him over to the table, and it felt longer, it was probably only a minute, but they're holding this little pipe thing over his mouth, and they're trying to tap air into his lungs, and they're saying, breathe, baby, breathe. That's not the experience you want with your first kid. That's not exciting. That's not something that you just want the normal birth. You want it to come out. You want to hold the baby. And I've experienced 2 normal births after, and so I can experience the way it's supposed to be, and it's a lot better. And I remember sitting there holding Deb's hand and crying and realizing that in all reality, God could take Drake from me right there. Like all the months of excitement and waiting and all of the other things, and God literally could, right there, just take it. That very realistically could have happened. And I was praying there at Deb's head, and I believe I was sincere. I don't know, because I didn't have to go through that door, but I believe I was sincere in my prayer that, God, if you choose to do this to me, I'm going to be okay with it. That is what I was praying at Deb's head. She had no idea what was going on. She was kind of, what's happening? Obviously I'm not going to be like, he's almost dying. That's not helpful either. But that illustration of something moderately minor, all things considered, that has allowed me to, when I was chatting with the lady, I was able to use that as an illustration of something God brought me through. That basically is hey, this is what God has done, and this is how I've been able to use it. Because God gives and God takes away, and that's how this is. But it also gave me a new appreciation for when things went well. And so, just from personal experience, that is how I approached just that evil. And again, I wasn't trying to tell them that this is how you should think, because if they don't have a relationship with God, there's just no context. There's no context to the comfort that God gives you in that situation. There's no context to any of that. But the other thing that this teaches you is you have to think through this topic of suffering before you start suffering. I compare it to if, let's say, an army rolled on property right now, and they were armed to the teeth, and they were about to take us over. What would you do? And some of us would just start panicking and run around in circles. Others of us who've thought through it would be like, ooh, I would drop here and I'd run here and I'd hide. If you thought through the situation, as crazy it is, and ladies, believe it or not, we guys think through situations like that for fun. But there are times where we think through, okay, if somebody rolls on property with a gun, where do I hide? And it's like, there's no one on property, but I'm just standing here going, well, I could go there, and I could go there, and I could run down that way, and I could call the bear in, and but we go through scenarios in our heads. I'm not saying any of them are actually going to help us, because some of them are utterly far-fetched, and I don't have a rocket launcher. But if you go through these scenarios in your head, if you say, if this happens, am I ready for this? And that's partly how I survived with the Drake situation, is I was thinking about it a lot that year leading up to it. I was thinking, what would happen if my kid went through X, Y, or Z? And then my kid went through one of them. And so that's why, as painful sometimes as this topic is to look at, we have to be ready, not only for our own sakes, but then there are times where we have to be ready to help other people. One of my guiding philosophies, if you could say it, if I'm ever in a situation I don't know what to do, I always try to take myself out of the situation and say, if I was counseling someone and they came to me with this situation, what would I tell them? Or the other side of that is, if someone came to me and they were trying to get counsel in this situation, how would I want to explain how I made it through? And that has kept me from doing some things very fleshly in various things that I've gone through over the years, where people have attacked me or I've been bad-mouthed, and I've wanted to just unleash on them. But I put myself out of the situation and said, if I'm talking to someone, let's say, 10 years down the road, and they are coming and they're asking me, how do I handle this situation? Do I want to be able to say, I did it right, and here's how I did it? Or do I want to say, yeah, I did this completely wrong, so don't do this, this, or this. And so there are times where it's helpful to remove yourself from a situation and try to think as if you are someone you are counseling. David does this. David will talk to himself. He's like, my soul, why are you so cast down? Why are you doing it? And David almost goes schizophrenic on us, where he's talking to himself, but really what it seems to be is he's pulling himself out of the situation and he's trying to look at it as separate from the event as possible, which is obviously not completely possible. Okay? So, with that being said, so the idea of evil being an unmet expectation. It's something we thought should turn out a certain way and it didn't. It's something we thought should be completed, but it wasn't. It's something we thought God would do, but he didn't. And so to understand this idea of evil, we're going to start with one that I'm going to tell you this because we have to have this in our mindset. But this is one of those that's probably, and those of you who've been through things harder than I have, you can correct me on this one, but it's probably not the most helpful one to start with. Okay, so I'm just telling you, like if you are Job's friends coming in and sitting with them, you probably shouldn't start with the sinners deserve to suffer method. It's probably not the way you should go. All right, the reason I'm sharing this is because I want you guys to understand the truth, though, because there are a lot of things that we do, and we get in trouble for them, and we suffer, and then we complain, why am I suffering so badly? For a perfect example of this, think Cain and Abel. Cain got jealous of Abel. He kills him. He hides him under the ground. God says, hey, your brother's blood is crying to me out of the ground. And he's like, all right, so you're going to be a vagabond. You're going to be accursed. You're going to be a wanderer. And Cain's like, my punishment is too heavy for me to bear. You just killed your brother. Like you beat him with a rock or a stick or something. You just killed your brother. And you have the audacity to say, my punishment is too heavy for me to bear. And you look throughout the Bible and you will find all sorts of people who have that same attitude. But honestly, the more godly attitude really is to recognize your own sinfulness and say, and here's where you've got to catch it. It's not saying that everything that happens to you is because of your sin. But here is the mindset that I think we as Christians have to have. We don't deserve much better. It's just, we are sinners. We have deserved much worse. And God has done us a great service in holding back on so much. It's, to use a silly and stupid example, when I was in college, we had, every Friday we had to scan our card at this computer, and it would tell us whether we got any demerits that week. And so some of you probably experienced that. So what would happen is, if you got a green screen, it meant you had no demerits. If you had a white screen, it would normally list the demerits you got. And if you had a red screen, it would mean you need to go see the deans this week. And so on Tuesday, there would be a meeting where you would go up and you'd form in a line outside this room, and there'd be a whole bunch of deans at the tables, and you'd go in and they'd show you what you got demerits for, and you'd have to talk about it. Now, this could be something as trivial as you left your blinds open. So literally, one of the times I got called up was I left the blinds of my room open at night. And I'm like, you couldn't just put that on the screen? Like, really? I don't know why. They had a certain list of certain demeritable offenses that would get you a red screen. So it could be something as trivial as you left your blinds open. It could be as something seriously as like, hey, we caught you off campus with this person, and yeah, you're getting kicked out. Like it could be something as trivial as you're blind, stupid. And it could be as something as serious as you got caught doing something seriously bad and you're in serious trouble. You all know what I thought every time I swiped that card and got a red screen. What did I get caught for? I mean, that, just for the record, I have no demerits on my record at college except for my first semester at college. Like, I had 23 demerits my first semester, and they lasted because of some stupid thing. But I have no demerits on my record. Does that mean I did nothing wrong? No, it means I didn't get caught much. It's just a fact, okay? Now, anytime I got demerits, there were times where I would have gotten demerits and I would have been like, I didn't deserve that, I didn't do that. But it's like, but I did this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and you didn't catch any of those, so You reap what you sow. Sometimes you just don't reap it in the way. So this topic of sinners deserve to suffer, it's a very harsh way of putting it. But the fact is, we are all sinners. There is a lot of times where we have brought this on ourselves. The reason I say don't start with this is because you run the risk of being Job's friend. Okay? Job's friends, they actually thought this way, but they got it wrong in Job's situation. So Job actually was not deserving of what had happened by any stretch of the imagination. He was still a sinner. He still deserved punishments for various things. He did not deserve what happened to him. But they thought so. Okay? So this idea of sinners deserve to suffer. Now, if you don't think sinners deserve to suffer, everybody would agree that Hitler deserves to suffer. Or if they really hate Donald Trump deserves to. There's always someone they could pick out of the lineup to say, like, well, I'm okay, but he's a really bad person. And then this is just the thing that I bring up a lot, is a lot of times the very thing you see in other people that you hate, you're doing it too, you just don't realize it. Because we're all that annoying person to someone else. But we never think of ourselves as the annoying person. Okay? We are all that lazy person to someone else, but we never think of ourselves as the lazy person. We are all that crude person. Maybe not all of us. But you get the idea. Like, there are people who will point at you and they have grievances with you, and you're like, me? No, I'm not doing it. Whether justly or unjustly, that is the way it is. And so if we all say, like, okay, we all agree that, like, Hitler deserves it. Okay. What about Stalin? Okay, Stalin deserves it too. Okay, well, where do you draw the line for people who don't deserve it? And somewhere, it's going to come down to, well, it stops at me. And so there are levels here. So when God punishes the guilty, he's obviously not doing anything wrong. When God punishes someone who deserves to be punished, well, duh, that's just life. And so a lot of the suffering in this world really could be chalked down to there are sinners who are receiving a punishment for their sin. Sometimes the sin itself is a punishment. So what we need to understand is God will a lot of times restrain evil. So in the Bible there's an illustration. There is a kingdom of Assyria. The kingdom of Assyria is basically like a dog on a chain. It's wanting to do evil. It's wanting to just pillage its way across the countryside. And God is withholding Assyria and only allowing it to do what he tells it to do. There's one specific instance where God unleashes Assyria and says, you are my tool, you are my rod of punishment. He unleashes Assyria on Israel because Israel is turning to other gods. And so God says, all right, if you're not going to listen to me, I'm going to unleash Assyria on you. Assyria comes rolling through, just wipes out Israel. But then Assyria gets all huffy about it and gets all like proud and basically goes beyond the call of duty. And so what God does is he turns around and he says, because you were proud, because you were puffed up, I'm going to punish you, Assyria. And so a lot of people would look at that and be like, well, God, you told them to go do it. Yeah, but Assyria still did the wrong thing. And so there's a lot of these situations in the Bible where God is restraining evil because man's heart is naturally bent toward evil. And there are a lot of times where the very punishment God brings on someone is just letting them go. It's this idea of they have desired it, and he says, go for it. A perfect example of this is Pharaoh. And it's funny to be, from what I heard, Pharaoh was the person who was the Hitler of his day. Like, nowadays, since World War II, we all use Hitler as kind of that, you're evil. Like, you're as evil as Hitler. But who did they say that about before Hitler? It was Pharaoh. As far as I understand, someone did some study on it, and I read it one time, so it must be true. But Pharaoh is like the stereotypical evil. But look at Pharaoh. He's a guy who basically is the hero of his own story. He is a guy who's standing up against this false god in his perspective. He's trying to uphold the honor and glory of his country. Okay, it's his own pride. And he hardens his own heart, and he hardens his own heart, and he hardened his own heart, which basically means he's sticking with it, and then God's like, all right, there comes a point where you're not able to change your mind. And God gave Pharaoh that personality to be able to do that, but then God basically says, all right, Pharaoh, I'm going to turn you over to your own destruction. So if we look at a lot of the suffering and evil in the world, it's that type of thing. God has turned people over to their own ungodly lusts. Now, if you want to make the case that someone suffering as an innocent is an evil, and then that would make God evil, there has only been one person in the history of the world who has ever suffered innocently. And you'd be hard-pressed to say that was an evil situation. I think you all know who I'm talking about. If you take the life of Jesus, he lived an absolutely sinless life, absolutely spotless life. He did nothing wrong. And the Bible says God poured his wrath out on Jesus. So if you want to look at a situation that was as unjust as you could possibly imagine, that was the situation. That is the only illustration in the history of the world of someone being punished for something they didn't do, and actually they didn't deserve any punishment at all. And they actually received the utmost in brutal punishments, but it was actually a mercy for the rest of us. So I want, like I said, it's a cumulative case, because we're all sinners is not convincing. God poured out his wrath on Jesus isn't necessarily convincing, okay? But what it's going to do specifically for us as Christians is I think it's going to give us a mindset we need to have when we are about to enter into suffering. I like during John's evening Stars Talk, we almost always go to 1 John 5, where it talks about, if we ask, he will give us these things. But the whole basis that is on is the idea that if he's going to give us Christ, and if Christ is going to be with us and in us, why don't you think he's going to give us everything else we need? And so the logic of the Bible so much hinges on Jesus. Not in the Sunday school version of like, oh, he's talking about Jesus, but this idea of if God the Father will do that to his Son for our sake, why wouldn't he do anything else for our sake? So if you can understand the cross, if you can understand that gospel situation, you can understand a lot more of the heart of God and why he does what he does. So if he's willing to pour out his wrath on Jesus for the good of other people, why on earth would he not care for you? If he takes the most important person in the history of the world and he's willing to sacrifice them for you, how much does he value you? If he is willing to give us his very Son, why don't you think he would listen to your prayers? Like you see how there's so many doctrines in the Bible that all come right down to God's Son went through this. And then the idea, if God's Son would forgive you for things, then you should be willing to forgive other people things, because none of those even come close to what you're forgiven. So you see how everything kind of hinges right there on this understanding of the death of Jesus. So if you understand the death of Jesus and the suffering that he went through for you, you kind of start to take again, you're taking a step back and you're looking at the panorama of it all and going, okay, I'm not picking up all the details, but I'm at least getting the big picture. Like I'm getting, almost imagine it, like let's say you've got like a 4K picture that's just hugely detailed and hugely massive, and you could not possibly fit it all on a screen. And as you zoom in on that picture, you're seeing all these little details, and they're really, really sharp details because, again, it's a really nice picture. But you're zooming in, and this is what you're seeing. You're seeing this little blip right here, and you're going, that doesn't make any sense at all. And what happens when we study the Bible and we look at all of this cumulative, all the cases of people throughout the Bible who went through things, what it's doing is it's slowly zooming out on that picture. And before you know it, you're way back here going, okay, that detail may still not make complete sense to me, but the whole picture is coming into focus a little better. And as you take a farther step back, you're like, okay, I see even more of it now. And the farther and farther back you get, the more and more of the picture you see, and you're like, okay. So we need to understand, from like God's point of view, he's way back there seeing the entire swath of the picture. In fact, Isaiah, I think it's middle of Isaiah, 47 to 50, 50 to 53, I'm not sure. Jesus is, God is appealing to Israel to give some arguments against the false gods. And so what he'll do is he'll say, hey, you know what? Why don't you ask him why things happened in the past? He's like, ask him if they know. Ask these false gods, because I'm the one who established this from the beginning all the way till now. I know why it happened. I know what's going to happen in the future. And what God's doing is he's saying, I have a complete understanding of time. I know why this happened. I know the ramifications it's going to have going forward. I know the purpose. I know what it was. And these false gods have no idea. So even if they did exist, they would have no idea what I'm doing. And that's part of the reason they're not even a true God. Because they could know the past, but they're not going to know the whys. And what God does as an evidence to prove his existence, he says, I not only know what happened, I can tell you why it happened. Because what he's doing is he's standing way back here, seeing the complete picture and going, okay, for what I'm going to do up here, I'm going to do this right here. And we all get all uppity because we're like, how dare you? Like, that was my life you just messed with. And God's like, but I have a purpose. And so if I can, again, use the illustration of Drake, that one little situation that I suffered for like a minute of time has allowed me to have a much broader understanding of some things. And it has allowed me to talk to people because I was in the tight place, so to speak, for that section of time. Now, it all turned out to be about a day. And the really hard part turned out to be about a minute. And in the course of that week, that's a huge amount of time. In the course of my lifetime, that's a very small amount of time, but it's a very impactful amount of time. And so any of you who've suffered anything, you understand, like, that moment is very impactful, very changing on your life. But imagine, in the scope of eternity. It might be hugely impactful for eternity. It might not. And so, again, if we understand that evil and suffering has this idea, again, unmet expectations. They are situations where, yes, there are a lot of times we suffer because we deserve to, because it's sin. There are a lot of times where we suffer, as we get into the next point, there are times where we suffer seemingly innocently, but we understand the only innocent person was Jesus. And understanding the sacrifice and suffering of Jesus helps us understand the heart of God, which then allows us to withstand. Now, as we continue through this, moving on, point number 2, which is on the back here. It is not unjust for God to use evil to promote good. So this idea that a loving and just God would never do evil, again, I want to use silly examples, because if I use the serious ones, we'll all start crying. But a silly example would be something, let's say you're a little baby and you need to have your diaper changed. Any of you who have ever changed the baby's diaper, you understand they don't like it, okay? It's a very painful experience for them for some reason. That, or it's just, my expectation is I expect to be warm and clothed, and right now I am not. And what is that cold thing? Stop it, that is the level of discomfort a child screams at. As we get older, yeah, we do still scream at that, but we become a little bit more hardened in what we've expected from the world, so we don't scream quite as badly on that situation. But the baby doesn't know what to expect, doesn't know what's normal, and it's getting its backside wiped, and it's like, wah! Now, if that baby has a rash, then it's a really important thing to take care of it. But that baby's not going to like it any step of the moment. But for that situation, that is an evil, that is suffering, that is an injustice, because I deserve to have my diaper on. But it's for its good to say, we have to take that diaper off, we have to put the cream on, and then we're going to send you back, to your comfort area. And so if we take something as silly as that example, but then we start looking at some things in our own life, and like I said, this is probably not something you tell them, okay? If you're talking with someone who's suffering, you don't be like, well, you're just being like a baby with a diaper. No, but this is a way that we can think through and say, listen, there are things God is doing to us because he's not about our comfort. God's not doing stuff to us to make us comfortable. He's building character. He's growing us. There's things he's doing that literally there are times where he has to change our diaper, and we don't like it. And that's what God will do sometimes. He'll shake the nest up. Ecclesiastes talks about this, where God will do things so that we remember he's God. And so with that in mind, there are times where there are evil things that God is going to use for our good. And that's not unjust of him. I think when I was a little kid, when I was born, I had a heart issue. And apparently I had a big old hole in my heart that they had to take care of. In order to take care of a big old hole in someone's heart, I don't know if you know this, you have to cut them open, and then you have to do some work to seal that hole up. You know, you can't just we'll just leave it, it'll take care of itself. I'm pretty sure that if I had understood what was going on as a baby, I wouldn't have appreciated that, you know? And so there are times where there are serious injuries or harm that is there that needs to be taken care of, and you need to do surgery. And so there are times where God says, I see something in you, and I'm going to start doing some surgery. And sometimes he uses evil to do that. Now again, the final point, I guess you could say, you can look through the notes if you want more of these things. But how on earth can you explain the entrance of evil into the world? That's a tougher one. So we know evil's in the world. We all understand that it's man's free will, really, that's making choices and making decisions. And you can see some inadequate explanations that people have had through the years to basically say, this is how evil came into the world. So, you have the evil God and the good God, and okay, we don't buy that. Okay, if he's a powerful creator, but he's just ineffective as a governor, and you're like, so he's really powerful, but he's just bad at his job. Okay, the Bible would not bear that out in the least. Everything we know about God in the Bible is he is supremely powerful, supremely wise. So anything that he's going to do is going to be wise. And I think this is something that Job would have agreed with. Job came into it saying, God gave me all this stuff. God took it all away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And to put it in Job's perspective, he went through all the evil you could imagine that we could suffer. He lost all his possessions. He lost his family. He lost all of his buildings. He lost any way that he could make his money back. So it's not even that he was just robbed blind. He was robbed blind, and anything he could use to make money again was taken from him too. All of his kids were killed. That's the normal suffering that people bring up when they're like, how could a good God allow suffering? Well, Job lost 7 kids in one day because a windstorm, a calamitous evil, a windstorm came through and took out the pillars of the building, and the building collapsed. That's not something you can plan for. That's not something you can even expect would happen. And in fact, Job, to the best of his knowledge, was trying to plan for all these eventualities because he not only repented of his own sins, he was offering sacrifices in case his children had sinned and hadn't confessed. He was trying to appeal on their behalf to God, and God still allowed that to happen. And then further, because a lot of times we can withstand really, really well when we're healthy, but then God took Job's health as well. And yet Job still sat there and just bore it. There's a reason, it's the patience of Job. He bore it. And then there's a lot of times where, we can lose everything. As long as our health holds up, we're okay. But then our health gets lost, and we're like, all right, as long as I have that one person who I can depend on, and that one person Job could depend on, his wife, she turned her back on him too. And so I think Job and his wife are a perfect illustration of how, honestly, a lot of Christians respond. Because Job's wife, there's a lot of preachers who give her a really bad time. But you have to remember, she went through every step of that pain as well. And now she's sitting there watching her husband die of some weird disease that he's just oozing away. And she finally just cracks. In fact, Ecclesiastes 7 will say that surely oppression makes the wise man mad. So surely oppression is going to make the wise man lose his sanity for a moment. That's something important to remember, because we can have all of our defenses up. We can have we can be ready for it and braced and kind of in that position. But the fact is, when it hits us, the Bible says that surely oppression is going to drive even the wise man mad. It's not an inevitable. You can survive it, but there are going to be moments where you're like, okay, I was not acting the way I should. And I think we all, would confess that there are times where things got really hard and we got a little too snippy, or we started doubting the goodness of God, or we started doubting God's sovereignty, or we started, walking away from this good thing. Another perfect example of this is John the Baptist. John the Baptist is in prison. He was the one who stood and pointed at Jesus and said, "Here is the Lamb of God. Behold." That's him. And then when he's in prison, what does he do? He sends out messengers to Jesus to say, "Are you the Messiah, or do we wait for another?" Why? Well, because Jesus wasn't quite meeting the expectations of the Messiah. He was that unfinished circle because they had an unrealistic expectation, and Jesus wasn't meeting the expectation. And so he was like, "Are you really the Messiah? Because I totally thought you were. I pegged you for it, way back then." And so what Jesus did is he said, "Hey, let's just look at some of the works I've been doing. And that's going to be my answer." And so if we understand that there are situations that happen, we have to keep coming back to this idea that the Bible is going to say God knows what he's doing. He is all wise, and he actually does know how to rule things. This is the logic that is presented at the end of Job. This idea that God is an all-wise, all-good God who actually knows what's going on is the exact logic God uses against Job. Because what happens when Job keeps saying, "I want my day in court, I want my day in court, I want to have a talk with God"? What does God do? He shows up, and instead of giving Job any answers about the why, he basically says, "Job, look at all the things I'm keeping track of, all the way down to the goats giving birth on the rocks, and I gave this bird the foolishness to not care that its eggs got stepped on. That way it wouldn't live its whole life in just screaming grief. I gave it the foolishness to basically say, you lay your eggs on a rock and somebody steps on it," and the bird's like, "Oh, okay." Most of us, if we left our baby on a rock and someone stepped on our baby, I hope we wouldn't be like, "Oh, okay." But God actually built that type of character into a bird to make it intentionally stupid so that it wouldn't live a life of absolute pain. Because it's like, "I lost another one. Why do I keep doing this?" No, God's just like, "Nope, it's just going to move on and lay more eggs." And what God's doing is he says, "I designed all these animals to act a certain way, and then I gave them the personality to fit their environment. And I'm keeping track of it all." And so what God's trying to reinforce is the idea is he knows what's going on, and he's in charge of it, and he's controlling it. Another one that some people, this is a little more controversial one, but actually, if you look at the very back page of the last page I gave you, a lot of people will appeal and say evil came into the world because, well, people need to be able to choose evil to show their love is genuine. They don't really. You don't need to be able to choose evil. The illustration I heard someone use, and I put it in here, the Holy Spirit and the Father and the Son, they all have perfect love to one another, but none of them can choose evil. None of them can just out of the blue say, "I'm just going to do the wrong thing, and that proved that I loved you more before." Now, in a way, God gave mankind the freedom to say, "I am going to allow you to choose to obey me or not." So there is a level of freedom there, but it's not necessary to prove your love. Okay? Anyway, here's how I believe happened. Again, going back to that illustration of we're looking at the big panorama, big picture, we don't know what's, we're trapped in this little pixel right here, and we don't know what's going on. I think when we read in the Bible, and it talks about the Garden of Eden, and it talks about that tree of the knowledge of good and evil and all those things, we don't know why that tree was there. My simple contention is, because a lot of people say, well, why would God even put that tree in the garden? Why would God even do that? That seems very irresponsible of God. We don't know why that tree was there. We don't know if it was strictly a test. We don't know if God just said, "You know what, everything's perfect, but I'm going to put the test tree in the middle of the garden." If that is God's purpose, if that was the purpose of the tree, that's fine. God can do that. Because it would be like this. If I told all of you guys and I said, "Hey, I am putting a bottle of poison right here on the middle of this table. I'm going to label it poison. I'm going to make sure it glows when you look at it. This is going to be a bottle of poison. Don't drink the poison." Y'all clear? Don't drink the poison? Poison? Bad? And then I walked away, and one of you was like, "I don't believe it's really poison." And you walked up there, and you took a swig of it, and you died. You can't then turn around and say, You shouldn't have left the poison on the table. I made about as clear a warning as I could. I left it in about as obvious a place as I possibly could. That one's not on me. Now you could ask, why was there poison on the table? Why did you even have a bottle of poison? And it's like, I don't need to tell you that. The fact is, I had it, and I had at least the decency to say, don't touch it. And so this idea of evil entering into the world, God put a tree in the very middle of the Garden of Eden and then took the time to tell Adam and Eve, don't eat of the fruit. So he told them, it wasn't even like with Mount Sinai where he said, don't touch it, because there's times where you could touch something by accident. He said, don't eat of the fruit of the tree. It wasn't something you could do accidentally. It was an intentional choice. You had to reach up, grab it, pull the fruit off, bring the fruit to your mouth, polish it a little bit, and then you had to take a bite. Like, that's a multi-step process you don't do by accident. But a lot of people will still bash God because they're like, why on earth did you put it in the middle of the garden? Because it's a very obvious place you can't miss. Why'd you put the tree there? We don't know. Well, why even put that test there? We don't know. But for whatever reason, God chose to say, this is how I'm basically going to do it. And if we trust God's wisdom, we understand he put it in a very obvious central location so that people would notice. And so as far as that God allowing evil to enter, evil entered because man sinned. And everything that we've been suffering has been a result of that early sin. So in a way, you could say all suffering is a result of sin, either your own or someone else's. And instead of focusing on the suffering, we should then focus on the idea that there will be a day where God will redeem this whole world and drive all the suffering away. One last point of view that I think is helpful, for myself at least. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, there's a lot of things we can endure if we have the right frame of mind for it. And his illustration is, I want you to imagine you're at a hotel, and you walk into a hotel room, and I'm expanding on his illustration, so if you go read his illustration, you won't find all of it. But let's say you walk into a hotel room and the shower's a little bit leaky. That's probably going to bother most of us, right? Like, we paid for a nice hotel room. We expect it to be nice and perfect. So last year I was at a Red Roof Inn, and my children walked out of the bathroom and walked to the bed, and they had dirty feet by the time they got to the bed, and that was disgusting because this is a hotel room. You don't expect to have dirty floors and dog poop outside the door. But that's what I found at the hotel. So that's why that place I'm not going back to, because it's a hotel. You expect a certain standard of experience. But he said, I want you to imagine that you're in a prison, and those same things happen. Are they now bad? So you get out of your prison shower and you walk across the floor to your prison bed. Are you really going to be terribly concerned about the fact that there was some dirt on the floor? No, because it's a prison. You expect much worse. The fact that you even had a shower is a huge thing. Because you're in a prison. And you expect a completely different set of standards in a prison than you do in a hotel room. So if I'm in a prison and I open the door and there's dog poop outside the door, that's life here. You have an expectation based on where you are. Now just think about it though. Now this world started out as a paradise, but is it still a paradise? Not really. In fact, I think in a comparison between a hotel and a prison, this world is closer to a prison. But a lot of people expect, in a world that is a lot closer to a prison, they expect to get the hotel treatment. So they expect everything's going to go their way and they're going to have a life of comfort. And God says, I never promised you that. In fact, I don't want you living for the things of this world. Because if you think about the hotel or prison mindset, most of us would be willing to stay in a nice hotel a little longer. Most of us would do everything to get out of a prison. And God's idea is, we're to approach this world as this isn't my home. It's just some place I am right now. Gonna make the most of it, but it's not a place to get comfortable. So, in this idea of suffering, it really is about the mindset that you go into it with. This is one I do want to open up questions or comments. I don't think I'll have all the answers, but someone else in the room might. So, questions or comments, other things that are helpful in this arena. Otherwise, we will call it a day.